incredible presentations from you both, and really drawing out the commitment. I mean, all of those C's you talked about, Emma, are reflected back from both of your presentations. We have a question, Tillman, for you. How might Rotary influence the desire for a world free from nuclear weapons? From Ron Payne, from the Rotary Club of Eaglehawk.
Well, I think Rotary has extraordinary capacity to focus energy and commitment and, real practical activity in a focused and coordinated way and be really persistent. And I think that is demonstrated so well with Rotary's extraordinary work for polio eradication, which, on several occasions when that program has been in in tough circumstances, with this constant tension that the closer you get to the end, the more it costs to eliminate the last few cases. And is this really feasible when you're fighting fire with fire, largely with an attenuated vaccine virus that can revert to virulence and cause disease as the principal tool to fight the disease is a real challenge. And Rotary sticking with that and convincing WHO and CDC and other key partners that this had strong civil society international support was a crucial role. And I think nuclear weapons in many ways are the similar issue. We don't have a vaccine, unfortunately, but the next best thing is a treaty. And we've seen how effective treaties can be in controlling other indiscriminate weapons. So it really needs the engagement of citizens around the world in a persistent, focused, practical way to raise these issues, to educate people, to advocate with governments in a completely non-partisan, humanitarian-based way, very similar in lots of ways to the way the Red Cross does. And I think Rotary's engagement in a more substantial and persistent and ongoing focused way in that work could make an enormous difference. But already one of the beauties of Rotary is that it is, as I'm learning, is that it has both these sort of broad global shared priorities for action that enable this enormous capacity around the world to be mobilised. But it also has huge flexibility for clubs and groups to take on their own issue and express those commitments and those interests in their own ways. So I think that's a beautiful combination of having a shared vision but being able to work on it in so many different ways that I think Rotary provides. And clearly the collaborative and supportive, encouraging environment that Rotary provides is also enormously important, because this is hard work. Nuclear weapons are not nice things to think about. You can get bitter and twisted thinking about nuclear weapons all day, every day, if that's all you do. So, you have to have a fair bit of strength and support and resilience to keep at that. And again, that makes collaboration and sharing and supporting, working with other people, essentially the only way to do this work. So I think the people of Rotary can bring an enormous amount to this issue.
And Emma, I saw you nodding there about that idea of bringing in that type of collaboration. And you were speaking earlier about when you were talking about some of those first points about the complexity of conflicts and the need for that more multifaceted response. And I think that's what you're talking about too, Tillman. We know that in both your movements, Emma, in your conflict transformation work, which requires these sorts of sustained engagements with people as things continue to rapidly change, and similarly for you, Tillman, the ongoing commitment. These are things that you've been working on in that very way you were talking about, Emma, through collaboration, through power sharing, through taking the ego out of the work and creating larger movements towards goals that are shared or congruent goals for the people that you work with. Any reflections on how you bring people into that orientation, which is so important in both your experiences? Emma, would you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Rotary is a testament to that. Is that all of us want meaning, and we want to be part of something bigger and better than ourselves. And I think no more than young people. I mean, there's a fantastic piece of research that actually is about ISIS, as in the terrorist organization. And a lot of the reasons that young people joined it was because they wanted to be involved in something that was big and was changing the world. And so, of course, there was a different kind of frame there. But I don't think that desire in any of us as humans to be part of something is there. And so I think that's up to us to be able to mobilize that. And Tillman alluded to the campaign to ban landmines, actually, which I got to be a part of. And that was so much of just grassroots, ordinary, community-based organizations coming together and saying, unacceptable, we don't want to live in this kind of world. And obviously that's what we need for nuclear weapons. That's what we need in terms of demanding our political leaders, but also our business leaders, our thought-provoking leaders, our charismatic leaders, to be able to set values and ways of being in the world that are different to and more than what we get now. I think we really need to be expansive and inclusive and challenging some of those root causes of conflict that we face. So I don't think it's that difficult. I think it's about welcoming people in, inviting people, giving them an opportunity to be part of something. And we so often look up. We look to the United Nations, we look to our political leaders to fix everything. And I think that's part of my point, is it's way too complicated. I know that Tillman is familiar, obviously, with the Korean Peninsula issues around nuclear issues. And North Korea has some genuine frustrations about being for 70 years in a war that we all in Australia think finished back in the 50s, and we have veterans marching in our Anzac Day parades. In North Korea is still a very real threat, that they feel that any time now they can be invaded by US troops from South Korea, that China's at their back. And so they have nuclear weapons because they don't feel safe. That doesn't justify those weapons, but it does help us to understand that there are deeper problems behind what is often a cry for help or pay attention to us. You people treat us like we're subhuman. And so I think we need to go deeper. We need to bring more people in. We need to all keep asking questions. What's really going on here? What's behind the story that we're being told?
Thanks, Emma. Tillman.
Perhaps just a couple of thoughts. I think one of the things that really inspires me, and I'm particularly inspired, as Emma mentioned, by the extraordinary young people who've provided such uncompromising and visionary leadership, that leadership is a renewable resource and nobody has a monopoly on it, and all of us can build it, share it, promote it, celebrate it. I think that's a really important thing. And look at what works. And, at the first ICANN board meeting, which we had in this building, actually, or just a couple of buildings up, we repeated to each other something that I think Roosevelt, the former US president, had said: try something, do something. If it works, do more of it. If it doesn't, try something different. It's pretty simple, but actually pretty sensible. And what we did with ICANN essentially was, it was a few of us in Melbourne who picked up an idea that was a challenge that was circulated on email by a wonderful obstetrician in Malaysia called Ron McCoy, frustrated by the failure of nuclear disarmament and at the same time inspired. So this is mid-2000s, inspired by the extraordinary success of the international campaign to ban landmines. Initially, a coordinated civil society campaign working with the leadership of one government, not the largest or most powerful, was the government of Canada, then joined by a few others, Ireland and Austria and Norway. Despite the opposition of the major users and producers, the largest and most powerful states, Russia, US and China, that still haven't signed that treaty, was able to get the treaty over the line to ban landmines in less than a decade. So we shamelessly modelled ICANN on the international campaign to ban landmines. Don't set up a new organisation, build a campaign coalition that deals partners in, make it as simple and inclusive as possible, have a really clear message as long as you agree to work non-violently, agree with the goal of eliminating nuclear weapons through a treaty process. You're in, doesn't cost any money, you don't have to come to meetings if you don't want. And use the humanitarian evidence, the non-partisan humanitarian evidence, which undercuts a lot of the arcane sort of political and security language and superstructure that's been built around nuclear weapons, to focus on the reality that these are unacceptable weapons, of what they actually do, and include the survivors as the most powerful, authentic, compelling lived stories of what these weapons really are. They're the experts on what these weapons really mean. And run with it. We had no idea that 10 years on, we would be the main partner for governments in getting a new treaty, or that there would be hundreds of organisations working in this coalition. But, if you have a vision and a plan and you can work together with persistence, then that's how stuff usually happens. A few people working on something.
Absolutely. Thank you. We've got a question for Emma. Emma, and this picks up on what you were just saying about how do we ask the questions that help us understand the situations better, and therefore be better placed when we're thinking about our engagement in conflict situations. We've got a question about Myanmar, and I guess the question's about what can be done from an interventionist perspective, but I'd also add how do we increase our understanding of what can be done, if you've got any reflections. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I see the question, and I mean, this question of intervention is so interesting. I know, and some people in Myanmar have been calling for UN intervention, send us troops. But intervention is so much more than sending militaries into other people's countries. And I think that's part of my point, is that the world is not like that now. It doesn't actually help us to go into somebody else's place and put troops on the ground. There is a place for peacekeeping, for sure. But I think when we want to talk about intervention, we want to talk about things like recognition. Who is the legitimate partner here? For example, for Australia. What should we be saying in newspapers and narratives? What kind of aid should we be providing people? How should we be even supporting refugees who fled those situations in terms of building their education capacity, leadership, in order to go home to those places and help rebuild them and reconstruct them? So in the Myanmar situation, I would say right now, we have an imperative to recognize the efforts that have been made by those in opposition to the military, such as this week the National Unity Government was launched. And a number of governments around the world have started recognising it. I also saw that the World Trade Union Movement had recognised it yesterday, of course, led by Australians. So there are a lot of interventions that we can make that are not about escalating a conflict with lots more military engagement. I think the other thing is this whole question of sanctions, and maybe that's a whole different topic to unpack sometime, but there is this tendency also to sanction countries or people. I think we need to use those very, very carefully, because we also end up isolating certain countries in wide sweeping sanctions, and we want to be able to be more sophisticated than that. So that's why I say this is a time where we really need to be collaborating with each other. I get to work on Myanmar in a different way to the Australian government. I get to work in Myanmar in a different way to the United Nations. There are things that the UN can do that I can't do. There are things that I can do that they can't do. And so we really, really have to work together when we talk about anything like intervention, because it's not just to Myanmar. It's a regional conflict. It's a geopolitical conflict. And sometimes the intervention is in Washington or Beijing more than it is on the ground in Myanmar. And I think that's something where we need to have a more sophisticated response. And that's not something that is something that people can be a part of. Any of us can be speaking to our political leaders at the moment about we expect you to show up. We expect you to be supporting people fleeing the situation. We expect you to recognize the new government of Myanmar. We expect you to be finding diplomatic ways to be speaking to the other actors involved. And so, yeah, that's something we can all be involved in, but it's not about us sending more troops to the ground and trying to hold off a situation. And I think, yeah.
Thank you, Emma. I've got a question for both of you. There's an interest in Rotary's relationship with the UN, but also what changes might we influence in terms of the UN's ability to influence in situations like you've just described, but also in terms of its Security Council and so on. So one question was, would it help if Rotary had a seat at the UN, or would it help to have changes to those critical aspects of how the UN does respond? We might start with Tillman, if that's okay.
Good luck with that, and I'll follow up.
Yeah, that's an easy one. Yeah, look, if you were designing the United Nations now, you would do it a little differently. And particularly the permanent membership of the Security Council, which is a sort of post-colonial, end of Second World War relic, is particularly inappropriate in the modern world and a particular constraint on effective United Nations action. Of course, the UN is captive to the governments that constitute it and can really only go as far as they will allow and resource it to go. And it's chronically under-resourced. I mean, I am so amazed at what the UN achieves, and particularly what WHO achieves, you know, with far fewer resources than most state health departments in many parts of the world. Extraordinarily important work. So it's not as if it's, you know, the failings of the UN are largely failings of the governments in the end that constitute it. But the reality is that it's extremely difficult to make structural changes. So I think the trick for me, and particularly around the nuclear weapons ban treaty, as the example that I've been most intimately involved with, was I think the United Nations worked brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. And we were all expecting that a treaty banning nuclear weapons would happen in the same way as the landmines and cluster munitions treaties, the most recently preceding ones on an indiscriminate and inhumane weapon, that were led by initially one and then a group of like-minded states who organised their own forum, so they were less subject to the pressures and the weakening influence of unsupportive states, built support and then took it to the wider international community, including the United Nations. But the way that the ban treaty happened, the nuclear weapons ban treaty, was different, and I think exploited a particular merit of the United Nations General Assembly. It's the most fundamental and inclusive and democratic organ of the United Nations. And also, unlike many of the other disarmament-specific fora at the UN, the Conference on Disarmament, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, review conferences, those rely on consensus, which sounds nice, but in reality means absolute rock bottom, lowest common denominator, and that even one government, one obstructive government, can block progress. The Conference on Disarmament, which is supposed to be the international body where the UN negotiates disarmament treaties, because of one particular nation, has not been able to agree even on an agenda, a program of work, since 1996. So taking the negotiations for the Prohibition Treaty to one of those fora would have been an utter recipe for failure. The General Assembly has the advantage of not just the political and moral authority of its inclusiveness and its fundamental nature in the UN system, but also the fact that if consensus can't be achieved, it can make decisions by a two-thirds majority vote on substantive matters, so that a minority cannot obstruct. And once processes are created through the General Assembly, they have the mandate of that whole big basis of the UN. They become UN business. in this case for the UN Secretary General, who's the depository of the treaty, the offices of disarmament and legal affairs. So it's UN business, and it gives it a level of authority that it couldn't have otherwise have had. So I think the way that those negotiations brought the interests of global humanity and democracy really into a space that for decades has been captive to the shenanigans of the nuclear armed states, basically, and what they will permit and allow. And really, in a process that they couldn't obstruct, was extremely constructive. And so I think the UN is a complex beast. There are many ways of engaging with it, but I think there are real ways of using it well.
Thank you. Emma, I think you'll agree. Tillman took that well.
He did, but I do want to add something. I mean, why is the question for Rotary to join the UN and not for the UN as a club of governments to be joining a world government that's led by Rotary? And I think that's a sort of fickle statement, but I think that this is the kind of thinking that we need to be doing. Is exactly as Tillman said, this is something that came out of a post-World War II era. I maintain that even if we invented it today, it would come out the same, because those dominant states who have power have set it up in such a way that it suits them, and that's fine. I also think it's a fundamental mechanism for dialogue, and it forces those countries to have to sit together, so that's fine. I think what's happening in the world, though, is that we're seeing democracy, we're seeing people's movements, we're seeing organizations like Rotary almost go above and beyond the mandate of the UN. And so actually what we probably need is a world government or a world convention. Every year, business people and influential leaders go to Davos to discuss the future of the world economy. Why isn't that Rotary and the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict and ICANN and Muhammadiyah, the largest civil society movement in Indonesia, the largest in our region actually, why aren't they coming together in a Security Council that sets the agenda for the future of the world? Because in some ways they have more power because they have people. And I think this is what I mean about creativity going forward, is young people need us to think quite differently to what leads the world. So the question would be for me then is, would we allow the UN to sit in that council as opposed to Rotary begging its way into a circle of governments, which in many ways is dysfunctional, but does operate on an extremely low budget, and in many ways is really changing its staff all around the world have changed its way of working and are reaching out and collaborating with others. So keep the UN, it's important, we need it, but equally let's invent the next thing that actually addresses the real issues of the planet.
Great. Thank you, Emma. We've already come to an end of our Q&A time. That was very quick, and I'm sorry that there are a few questions that didn't actually get to be spoken to. But thank you so much, Emma and Tillman. It's been really, really stimulating. I mean, really insightful, but also lots of complementarity in both ways in which we think about that importance of movements towards the sorts of change that we want, and how to be inclusive and also generative. And I think, Emma, you ended that with that fantastic challenge to all of us. Thank you both.